Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. So I will try to keep this as short as possible. And for those who are watching the film, it's cold in here, we have no heat. Therefore, the new vestments. But I really want to address the readings this morning in basically two parts. So a sermon with two parts. First part, the gospel. How many of you are very comfortable with the story that we read this morning of Jesus going into the temple and overthrowing the money changers and doing things like that? Does that sound like the Jesus that we tend to worship and hold up and revere? Or does it sound perhaps a little bit out of character? I mean, here's the gentle Son of God who welcomes the little children, who tells us to love our neighbor as ourselves, love our enemies. And now we have him in the temple driving people out with a whip. And it just seems like this isn't perhaps the same person that I like to think about. Yet, the reality of it is, number one, I don't know how much of the story is completely accurate. John is the only one that gives the detail of this particular event. But the event is in all four Gospels. That's something to know, because that says to me that it's extremely important event, that each of the gospel writers would include it in their writings. So what is it that we can learn or think about this morning with this Jesus who might seem uncharacteristic to us? Number one, for me, it certainly makes him fully human, because the response of an injustice is what we're hearing about. He goes into the temple, and in the temple, the people, all people, the poor people, the rich people, or whoever that came into the temple, were to buy their sacrifices. And so the marketplace wasn't a marketplace where they were selling sweaters and Starbucks coffee. What they were doing was they were selling things for the temple to be used in the temple. The problem was that part of what was going on there too was paying taxes to the Romans. And the Roman coins, of course, had the image of Caesar on it. So that in and of itself would probably be enough to make Jesus upset. But here is the real issue that I uncovered and that I think Jesus was responding to. And that was the fact that these money changers were the high priests who were in charge of the temple finances, let us say it that way. And the money that was being collected and exchanged was not an equitable amount of money. So the people were giving Roman coins and getting shekels back that were not of the same value. And so the temple was making money on the people. Now that is unjust. And that is what I believe that Jesus was, number one, very concerned about. And number two, that the temple itself was being used for this idolatrous kind of activity that we heard in the Old Testament. The very first commandment that we read at the beginning of our service is, there is only one God, and that's the God that we are to love with our whole heart, mind, body, and soul. And anything else that takes the place of God, money, profit, things like that, is wrong. It's idolatry. And so Jesus, I believe, shows us that in his humanness, God created us with these things that we call emotions, right? We're happy, we're sad, we're angry. And anger gets a bad rap, oftentimes, because we see any emotion, first of all, let me say this, any emotion, if it's used the wrong way, can be harmful, can be less than good. Any emotion used in an extreme can be harmful and not good. And so anger as an emotion can be used for destruction, it can be used for violence, it can be the root of a lot of different things that are negative and not of God. But anger also can be a motivator. It can be a motivator to remove the injustices that are in our society. And that's what we see Jesus doing. His anger was about the injustice, the misuse of the temple, the misuse of the money, the the abuse of the people who were exchanging their money. And so anger, I think, is really at the source of people who are caught up in the injustices in the world, oftentimes react with anger. Now, how many of you were angry at the Parkland shootings? Right? You know, how many of us are saying enough is enough? And how many of us want things to be different? You know? And so this anger that tends to seethe can go in two different directions, right? It can eat at us, it can make us sick to our stomachs, it can depress us, it can fill us with despair, or we can try to take action and find out what are the things that we can do to make a difference, because we are the people of hope, right? We are the people of hope in this community, in this state, in this country. Those of us who follow this foolishness of the cross believe that there is something greater that should be happening, something that can change. We believe that we can make a difference. But in order for the difference to happen, we have to take action. Jesus did not sit and seethe about the money changers. He did not sit and become depressed. He took action. And how extreme that action was, we don't really know. But it definitely was important enough to know that it's in all four Gospels. And so it's easy to sit back and watch the nightly news and say, wow, that's wrong, or I wish this was different. But yet, I think as the people of God, the people of hope, we are called to action. Now, my problem is always, but what can I do? What can I do as this one single citizen, you know, who gets frustrated and filled with despair or what have you? And I know that I always feel better when I'm able to do something as opposed to doing nothing. And that is what we struggle with. That's what we have to help one another with. That when we find opportunities where we can take action, like Kathy Gibson with the postcards to mail to our senators, to make phone calls to our senators or our House of Representatives, because even though you might agree with what they are doing, if you don't agree, you need to make your voice known. But if you agree, it's still important for them to have the number of constituents that they can report to Congress or whatever that I got 100,000 phone calls, or I got, 50 letters this week, or I got whatever I got. That's a helpful kind of thing, and it's a simple thing that we can do as citizens. I just wanted to highlight two things that I discovered that can also be done in terms of these wonderful teenagers that are rising up in this country and making their voices heard. Ann shared with me yesterday that there are 6 teenagers who are running for governor of Kansas. Yay, you know? I don't know how they're doing that. I haven't researched that. But these young people are taking action. And so on March 14th at 10 a.m., on the anniversary, 1-month anniversary of the shootings, students across the country are walking out of high schools for 10 minutes, 17 minutes. So at 10 a.m., they're leaving their high schools, walking out the door for 17 minutes, and then going back in. And I would invite all of us who are able, I happen to be traveling on that day, which I am very discouraged about, but to go to one of the local high schools, to just be there to support the students coming out, to say you are not alone. And so we did find out that South Kingstown is definitely walking out. I suspect North Kingstown will be as well. But check with your local papers or whatever. This is part of what the students have called March for Life. On March 24th, they're marching on Washington, as you probably have heard. And just for your information, people will be gathering, and I will be one of them, gathering at the State House here in Providence from 1 to 3 in the afternoon. So, if people need rides or what have you, what have you. But this action helps with the despair and the discomfort that we are all feeling, or many of us are feeling. I can't say we are all feeling, but many of us are feeling in the country. And so action is an important thing. that we are the hands and feet, the eyes, the ears of Jesus in our country today, in our communities. And we are called to be in action. Part 2 of the sermon. This piece of paper is an excerpt from something that was online that could be an insert into the bulletin today that I didn't get to the church in time, but it's by presiding Michael Bishop Curry. And as we all know, he's a very inspirational preacher, teacher, pastor, leader, and guide. Anyway, this is in response to the passage from Corinthians about the foolishness of the cross. And so I would just like to read this in closing the sermon. So this is from presiding Bishop Michael Curry. Some things just don't make sense. Water doesn't become wine. Bread and fish do not suddenly multiply. The lame do not jump up and walk. And most certainly, dead people stay dead, especially those who experience the horrific death of crucifixion. And yet, where Jesus is involved, all kinds of things that don't make much sense happen. In those earliest years of the Jesus movement, his followers didn't wear crosses around their necks or hang them in the homes in which they worshiped. They had other symbols, certainly, but not crosses. Crucifixion was not a historical curiosity, but a still present reality, and an agonizing and shameful one at that. To be crucified was to be executed as a common criminal. Worse, according to the Hebrew scriptures, cursed was the one who hung on a tree, on the wood of a cross. So, to speak of Christ crucified didn't make sense to many. It was a stumbling block, something foolish or offensive. But Paul said otherwise. Yes, Jesus could have avoided the cross, found some other way around it. But instead, he faced the worst of the world, the worst that the world could throw at him, and then broke through death itself, and leave an empty cross behind as witness to his astonishing victory. Some things don't make sense. The cross is one of them. But it stands now and forever as our rallying cry that God, not injustice, not suffering, not even death, has the final victorious word. Amen.